The story of how America built its great cities is one most people think they understand. After the Civil War, a rapidly industrializing nation began constructing courthouses, post offices, train stations, and city halls at a pace that matched its ambitions. By the late 1800s, these buildings were rising in cities across the country, grand, symmetrical, stone-faced structures with columns, arched windows, and domed rooftops. The explanation is clean: wealth, expansion, civic pride. Until you look at the numbers. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Take one example. The St. Louis Old Post Office and Custom House. Construction began in 1873. The city's population at the time was approximately 310,000 people. The building required 8 years to complete, consumed millions of dollars in federal funds, and was designed with load-bearing granite walls several feet thick, structural systems built for centuries of use, and interior spaces that could process volumes of mail and federal business far beyond what St. Louis generated at that moment in its history. Not slightly beyond. Significantly beyond. That alone could be explained as optimism. Forward planning. Americans, after all, built for tomorrow. But the pattern doesn't stop there. Across the same two-decade window, roughly 1870 to 1895, federal building projects appeared in cities that had populations in the tens of thousands. Pensacola, Florida. Evansville, Indiana. Galveston, Texas. Each received a federal customs house or post office of considerable architectural complexity. Masonry construction. High ceilings. Ornate facades requiring skilled labor that, in many of these cities, did not exist locally and had to be imported. The buildings were not modest civic structures scaled to their communities. They were, in proportion to the populations they served, enormous. Stop for a moment and sit with that. If a town of 15,000 people required a post office, a functional wooden structure with a counter and a sorting room would be logical. Cost-effective. Appropriate. What was built instead, in city after city, was a multi-story masonry building with arched window openings, decorative cornices, and interior marble finishing. The scale was not responsive to current demand. It seemed calibrated to something else entirely, something that either was expected to come, or something that perhaps had already been there. This is where the straightforward explanation begins to develop small, persistent cracks. The official historical framing attributes this building period to the Treasury Department's Supervising Architect program. Starting with Ammi B. Young in 1852 and continuing through several successors, the federal government centralized the design of public buildings, producing standardized but architecturally serious structures across the country. The explanation is legitimate. The records are real. The program existed. And yet, the Supervising Architect program produced buildings in a remarkably consistent architectural vocabulary, one that, when examined, draws heavily from traditions that predate American civic architecture by several centuries. The round arched window, the rusticated stone base, the projecting cornice, the central pavilion with a pediment, these are not American inventions. They come from a European tradition stretching back to the Italian Renaissance, passed through France, modified in England, and then, according to the standard account, transplanted to America by architects trained in the Beaux-Arts method or influenced by pattern books. That transmission is documented. It is taught in architecture schools. But there is a subtler question worth asking, one that the records themselves, not speculation, raise quietly. When you examine the buildings produced under this program side by side with European civic structures from the same period, the similarity is not merely stylistic. It is structural, proportional, specific. The thickness of walls, the height ratios of windows to floors, the treatment of entrances, the relationship between base, shaft, and cornice. These are not general similarities in the way that two cars from the same era both have four wheels. These are precise correspondences of a kind that typically emerge from a shared source, a shared training, a shared model, or a shared existing stock of something. That word, existing, is worth holding. Several architectural historians have noted, without resolution, that the speed at which high-quality civic construction spread across the United States in the post-Civil War period is difficult to reconcile with the documented labor supply. Skilled masons, stone cutters, and ornamental plasterers capable of executing this level of work were not abundant. Immigration was bringing craftsmen from Europe, certainly, but the volume of simultaneous projects and the consistency of quality across geographically distant sites raises questions about coordination and capacity that the labor records of the period do not fully answer. Not dramatically, not accusatorially, just not fully. In Galveston in 1875, a customs house was under construction at the same time as federal buildings in Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Louisville. Each was using similar stone detailing, similar interior ironwork, similar proportional systems. The supervising architect's office in Washington sent drawings. Local contractors executed them. That is the official account, and it is supported by documentation. What the documentation does not explain is where the finished quality of craft came from, consistently, across sites where the local skilled labor base was, by contemporary accounts, limited. Some researchers who have examined 19th-century construction records suggest that what looks like a building boom may, in some cases, be better described as a building renovation or adaptation period. That certain structures attributed to the 1870s and 1880s may incorporate earlier fabric, earlier foundations, or earlier structural systems that were updated, refaced, or repurposed rather than built entirely from raw material. This is not a fringe position. Adaptive reuse of earlier structures is a documented practice throughout European and American building history. What makes it interesting here is the scale at which the question applies. Not one building. Not one city. Dozens of structures across dozens of cities, in a compressed time window, displaying a quality and consistency of architectural execution that the documented labor supply and building industry of the period should have strained to produce, but apparently did not. The explanation that covers all of this is confident and available. Growth, federal investment, skilled immigration, centralized design. These are real forces. But there is a shape to this pattern that the standard explanation fits imperfectly. What makes the American case compelling is not that it stands alone. It is that it does not. Cross the Atlantic and the pattern reappears. Different country, different century framing, same structural discomfort. Britain's civic building expansion of the mid to late 1800s follows a trajectory that, on paper, maps cleanly onto industrialization and empire. Manchester needed a town hall. Leeds needed a municipal building. Birmingham needed civic infrastructure to match its industrial output. These needs were real. The buildings that answered them were extraordinary. Manchester Town Hall, completed in 1877, is a Gothic revival structure of such complexity and refinement that architectural historians consistently rank it among the finest civic buildings in Europe. Its exterior stonework is precise to a degree that requires not merely skilled masons but masons with a very specific and long-practiced competency in Gothic detailing, pointed arches, carved tracery, gargoyles, foliated capitals. This is not general masonry. It is a narrow and specialized craft tradition. The Gothic revival movement in Britain is well documented. Architects like Augustus Pugin and George Gilbert Scott championed a return to medieval building principles, trained a generation of craftsmen, and produced an identifiable school of design. The explanation is there. But the revival implies something important that often passes without examination. A revival requires, by definition, that something was interrupted. The medieval craft traditions that Gothic revival architects were attempting to restore had, according to the historical record, substantially declined during the intervening centuries. There is documented concern among Victorian architects and theorists about the degraded state of stone carving craft by the early 1800s. Pugin wrote about it. Ruskin wrote about it. The concern was genuine. And then, within roughly 2 decades, that craft appears across dozens of major civic projects at a level of execution that the revival movement should, by its own account, have been still struggling to rebuild. The speed is not impossible, but it invites a pause. In Leeds, the town hall completed in 1858 features a Corinthian colonnade of a scale and finish that placed contemporary critics in direct comparison with ancient Rome. The architect, Cuthbert Broderick, was 31 years old when he won the design competition. He had trained in Hull and made one trip to Europe. The building he produced required stonecutters executing some of the most technically demanding classical detailing in Victorian England, and it was completed on schedule, on budget, in a city whose primary identity was textile manufacturing, not architectural craft production. These are facts in the record. What the record does not provide is a clear accounting of where, specifically, the concentrated craft labor for these projects came from, and why it appears repeatedly already competent rather than in a visible process of learning. Now move to the infrastructure beneath the buildings. Across both Britain and America in this period, the underground systems, sewers, water mains, gas lines, and eventually electrical conduits, were being laid at a pace and to a specification that, like the buildings above them, seemed calibrated to populations significantly larger than those they were initially serving. London's Metropolitan Board of Works, under Joseph Bazalgette, completed a sewer system in 1875 designed to serve a city of several million people. London's population at completion was approximately 3.8 million. The system was designed for considerably more. Forward planning again. The explanation is available. But the American parallel arrives with an additional wrinkle. Cities like Chicago and Detroit received sewer and water infrastructure in the 1870s and 1880s that was, in several documented cases, connected to or routed around existing underground brick structures whose origins were not clearly established at the time of connection. Engineering reports from the period note the discovery of brick-lined tunnels and vaulted chambers during excavation that were attributed to earlier, informal construction. But the quality of brickwork in some of these structures was noted as inconsistent with what informal or temporary construction typically produces. These reports exist. They are not widely circulated. They are also not conclusive. They are simply observations made by working engineers that something was already there. Now consider the railways. The American rail network expanded at a speed that remains, even by modern standards, logistically remarkable. Between 1865 and 1890, the United States went from approximately 35,000 miles of track to over 160,000. The stations built to serve this network were not, in the majority of cases, modest platforms. They were architectural monuments. Cincinnati's Union Terminal, though completed later, was built on a site whose infrastructure history stretched back through several earlier station configurations, each larger than the demand at the time of construction seemed to require. More immediately, stations built in the 1870s and 1880s in mid-sized American cities routinely featured waiting halls with vaulted ceilings 60 and 70 feet high, structural ironwork of considerable sophistication, and facade treatments using the same Renaissance and Baroque architectural vocabulary appearing simultaneously in the federal building program. The consistency across types, federal buildings, civic buildings, rail stations, infrastructure, and across geography, American Midwest, American South, Northern England, the Midlands, is the thing that sits uncomfortably. Not because consistency is suspicious, but because consistency at this scale, across this distance, appearing within this compressed time window, typically has a source, a school, a tradition, a prior example from which all subsequent examples draw. The source, in the official account, is European classicism transmitted through architectural education and pattern books. That answer covers the stylistic similarities. It is less comfortable with the physical ones. The wall thicknesses, the foundation depths, the infrastructure oversizing, the craft quality arriving faster than the craft training records would predict. Some researchers examining these patterns across multiple countries have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive label, not to assign a cause but to give the pattern itself a name. A way of saying, this recurrence has been noticed, and it has been noticed not in one place, but everywhere the 19th century left its most durable marks. That label, and what it implies about what may have come before it, is where this pattern leads next. Every pattern eventually demands a name. Not because naming resolves anything, but because the human mind, confronted with recurrence across too many variables, too many geographies, too many timelines, eventually requires a container for what it has observed. The container does not have to be correct. It only has to be useful enough to hold the questions together while examination continues. The label that has gathered these architectural and infrastructural observations, the oversized civic buildings, the advanced craft appearing faster than training records suggest, the underground structures of uncertain origin, the consistency of form across continents and decades, is one that exists primarily in online research communities, in the margins of architectural history, and in the work of a small number of independent scholars who approach the 19th century built environment with what might be described as productive suspicion. That label is Tartaria. It is important to be precise about what this word is and what it is not. Tartaria, or Great Tartary, appears in historical maps and geographical texts from the 16th through the 18th centuries as a designation for a vast region spanning Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of what is now Russia and China. It was not a unified political empire in the way that Rome or the Ottoman state was a unified political empire. It was, in the understanding of European cartographers of the period, a geographic and cultural designation, a name applied to a territory and its peoples rather than to a single organized sovereign entity. This is documented. The maps are real. The name appears in encyclopedias, atlases, and diplomatic correspondence across several European languages for approximately 200 years. Then, in the early 19th century, the name largely disappears from cartographic and political usage. That disappearance has a conventional explanation. European geographic understanding became more precise, the region became better documented, and the broad catch-all designation of Tartaria was replaced by more specific national and ethnic identifications. Russia expanded. The Qing dynasty consolidated. The label became obsolete. This is the mainstream historical position, and it is supported by the documentary record. What the interpretive community that uses the word Tartaria today is concerned with is something different, and considerably more difficult to categorize. The argument, in its most measured form, is not that Tartaria was an empire that was deliberately erased. The argument, as some researchers present it, is that the architectural and infrastructural evidence of the 19th century is consistent with a world that was more built, more established, more technically capable, more extensively settled, than the standard narrative of that century describes. And that the buildings and systems attributed to the post-Civil War boom and the Victorian expansion may, in a portion of cases, represent the inheritance, adaptation, or continuation of something that preceded them rather than the creation of something entirely new. One interpretation holds that what we call the 19th century building period is, in part, a resettlement and renovation period. That populations moving into cities after a disruption of some kind encountered existing physical infrastructure and either incorporated it, modified it, or documented it as new construction without fully acknowledging its prior state. Disruption is a deliberately neutral word here. Could mean war. Could mean disease. It could mean a climatic event. The interpretive framework does not specify, and the more careful researchers within it resist specifying, because the evidence does not point clearly in any single direction. Another interpretation, more conservative and perhaps more compatible with mainstream architectural history, holds that no disruption is necessary to explain the patterns. Only a more honest accounting of how much pre-existing European building culture was transplanted to America not just through drawings and books but through actual transplanted fabric. That some of what was built in the 1870s incorporated structural elements, foundations, and even standing walls from earlier phases of construction that were not formally documented because documentation was inconsistent, and because the economic incentive was to build quickly and claim novelty rather than to catalog what had been found and reused. Both interpretations are speculative. Neither has been definitively established. Neither has been definitively refuted. What gives the Tartaria label its persistence, and what separates the more rigorous researchers from the more sensational ones, is that the underlying observations are not fabricated. The buildings are real. The scale mismatches are real. The craft quality arriving ahead of the craft training records is a genuine anomaly that architectural historians have noted without resolving. The underground structures encountered during 19th century excavation are documented in engineering reports. The oversized infrastructure relative to contemporary population is a numerical fact. The label Tartaria does not explain these observations. It collects them. And in collecting them, it asks a question that is worth sitting with regardless of one's position on the interpretive framework itself. The question is simply this: when we look at the 19th century built environment, at its speed, its quality, its consistency, its scale, are we looking at a society building or are we looking at a society inheriting? That question does not require Tartaria to be real in any particular sense. It does not require a hidden history or a suppressed civilization or a deliberate concealment of the past. It requires only the intellectual honesty to notice that the gap between what the standard account describes, a nation or several nations, building from ambition and raw material, and what the physical evidence on the ground suggests, structures of a quality and scale that the documented conditions of the period strain to produce, is not a gap that has been closed by the historical record. It has been noted. It has been observed by serious people in serious fields. And it has been, for the most part, set aside rather than resolved. The Tartaria interpretive community, whatever its internal variations and whatever the reliability of its individual contributors, has at minimum performed the function of refusing to set it aside. Of insisting that the gap is real, that it is large, and that it deserves a more rigorous answer than optimism and civic pride provide. Whether that answer involves a civilization, a disruption, a renovation, or simply a more complicated transmission of building culture than the textbooks describe, the physical record of what was built and what was built within, and what was built faster than it should have been possible to build, continues to stand in cities across America and Britain, mostly unremarked upon, mostly unquestioned, holding its weight, keeping its silence, not asking to be believed, only asking to be looked at carefully one more time.